In this video, we're going to look at pivot tables, and we're going to do a short tutorial on the topic of pivot tables. Now, pivot tables are a really useful feature in Excel, and they're actually a feature in Excel that a lot of employers are going to want you to know how to use, and you'll frequently see them listed as a necessary skill on job specifications for a whole range of jobs. So it's worth taking the time to learn about pivot tables. They're no doubt something that you may well find useful in the future if you've never used them before. So what do pivot tables do? Well, pivot tables, in short, basically allow you to quickly analyze and summarize information from a data set. And the word pivot comes in because you can quickly move things around to look at the data in different ways. And that's all going to become a bit clearer once we start actually building a pivot table in this tutorial. So we've got some example sales data that we're going to be using for this exercise. It's broken out by different stores, so store A, store B, and store C. And then we've got a monthly breakdown from January through to December 21. The different items that are in this data are chairs, desks, and cabinets. And then we've got the quantity of those items sold, the price they were sold for, and the revenue, which is the price times the quantity sold. So to insert a pivot table, you just need to make sure you're selected anywhere in your data set. Come up to the Insert ribbon and select Pivot Table. You now have the option to select New Worksheet, which is the default option, or Existing Worksheet, and then you can specify where in your worksheet you want it to go. I'm going to go with New Worksheet, and then we have a new worksheet that appears just like this. So I'm going to rename this to Pivot Table. Okay, there we go. So the way the pivot table works is you have your pivot table fields and you can actually move this around. So I'm going to move this over to this side just so it's a bit nearer the pivot table itself, which is here. And this is where you build the pivot table. So the quickest thing really to do to explain this is just to dive right in and get started with an example. So let's say we want to look at the total number of units sold based on the different items. So if I drag the item field down to rows, they populate into rows just like that. And then what I can do is take the quantity sold field and move it into values. And now we have the total sum, so the sum of quantity sold for each of these three items, cabinets, chairs, and desks. So we can see that there was 1,458 cabinets sold, 1,447 chairs sold, and 1,604 desks sold, giving a grand total of 4,509 units sold. And in case it isn't clear, what this is doing is basically just summarizing our sales data. So if I was to filter for chairs, and if I was to then highlight all of these cells to look for the sum, so we can see we get 1,447. And then what we get here for chair is 1,447. So that's all it's doing. It's summarizing our data based on the way in which we've designed our pivot table. So instantly you can see just from this really basic example of how useful they are as a tool for quickly summarizing data, and it avoids having to use sum ifs and to manually filter data. So yeah, they're a really powerful tool. Now, next up, we're going to look at the filter function in pivot tables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the store field down to filter, and you'll notice that we get this filter option appear here. And at the moment, this data is summarizing all of the different stores. But let's say we were only interested in store B. What I can do is select this drop down, then select store B, and then select OK. And now you'll notice we've filtered just for store B, and all the numbers have reduced because we're now only looking at one store. So if I was to come back to my sales data, we've got it filtered for chair already. If I was to filter for store B, we can then see the total there. We got 601. And then if we look at chair, so store B, 601. So again, you can see how it's working. Now, we can also add more data into our pivot table to make it more insightful. So let's say we want to look at the monthly breakdown. So we can drag the month field into columns. And then now we've got our data, the different items, filtered for store B, and then it's also broken out by the different months, which is obviously a really useful feature if you want to see which months had the highest sales and so on and so forth. A useful feature to remember about pivot tables is the fact that if your data updates, you can actually get the pivot table to update very easily. So let's say this figure here, 103, it turns out that that figure was actually an error and that we actually only had 13 sales of the chairs in January for store B. So if I go back to my sales data, I've got that figure there of 103. Let's say I update that to 13 because I find out that it was entered incorrectly. So I've changed that to 13. Now, it hasn't updated yet, the pivot table. It's still saying 103. But if I click into the pivot table, right click and refresh, you'll see it updates. So it's dynamically pulling the new data from our sales data tab, which is a really great feature of pivot tables. Now, this is just a quick example. Obviously, there's various other things I could do with the pivot table. Let's say I wanted to remove the quantity sold and I was interested in revenue instead. So you can see the pivot table's gone blank, but if I add the revenue into the values now, it will populate with our revenue figures. So it really just depends what you want to look at. But as you can see, this is a much quicker way for analyzing data than it is if you were to be writing out formulas or having to keep filtering with the drop downs in the data. So that's just a quick intro into pivot tables. Hopefully you found it useful, and be sure to subscribe and like this video if you want to check out more content like this in the future.